1976, the United States celebrates 200 years of independence and freedom. A vigorous Jimmy Carter was heading for the presidency. The Soviet Union, too, displayed pride in its achievements under the aging Leonid Brezhnev. Both leaders promised to reduce East-West tensions. But within 4 years, the promises had turned to anger and mistrust. The Cold War was far from over. Washington, D.C., January the 20th, 1977.
I believe the future is going to be very bright for all of us. You're partners of mine. Together, I'm sure we'll reach for greatness, and we'll never disappoint the people who put their trust in us. Thank you. Have a good time. We'll be seeing you tomorrow, a lot of you.
President Carter aimed to restore self-confidence at home and American leadership abroad.
Jimmy Carter was a completely fresh face. He was, in essence, an outsider. Nationally, most people had never heard of him.
Jimmy who?
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy who?
I don't know who he is.
Jimmy Carter's basketball player, isn't he?
He would say things like, "I will never lie to you. I believe in God. I have always been faithful to my wife." Now, in Washington, you can imagine the reaction was jaded and disbelieving and contemptuous. But people liked this very much. They wanted someone who was fresh and someone who was new and someone who was unsullied by the traumas and problems and corrosion of the past.
In his relations with the Soviet Union, the new president wanted to promote respect for human rights and to press for major nuclear arms cuts.
And we will move this year a step toward our ultimate goal, the elimination of all nuclear weapons from this earth.
President Ford and the Soviets had made an interim agreement on nuclear arms cuts at Vladivostok in November 1974. The agreement established common ceilings for strategic arsenals. President Ford's successor, Jimmy Carter, wanted to go much further. Brezhnev would be urged to put the arms race into reverse. Uncertain of Carter, Brezhnev reaffirmed his faith in détente.
Я от имени партии и всего народа заявляю, наша страна никогда не станет на путь агрессии, никогда не поднимет меч против других народов.
Carter sent Cyrus Vance, his Secretary of State, to Moscow with a set of proposals. One called for radical cuts in strategic arsenals, well below the Vladivostok levels. Vance had given Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin a preview of Carter's aims.
The morning we departed for Europe, Vance met with Dobrynin and, in effect, gave him the details of the proposal that he would present to Mr. Gromyko a few days hence. Dobrynin said what he had said to us all along. It's Vladivostok, marginal cuts, or nothing.
The Soviets bluntly rejected the American initiative.
Our position was very simple. We thought everything had been agreed in Vladivostok.
Он же нам предлагал перейти на резкие сокращения.
What he was suggesting was to make bigger, more drastic cuts, which we knew would take a very long time.
Это потребует уйму времени.
And in retrospect, I can see that President Brezhnev was quite proud of the limited agreement that he had concluded in Vladivostok. And to have a new American president come in and say that is not good enough, let's do much more and do it quite rapidly, took him by surprise.
In just assessing what...
At home, Carter and Vance promoted the Moscow talks as a positive move.
Do this. John, we're glad to have you back.
Thanks, Mr. President. I think on the whole, the trip was not only useful, but very necessary. It's interesting that Mr. Gromyko agrees with that conclusion. And I do not believe, contrary to what appeared in one of the papers today, that there were any miscalculations. We were very well prepared for what came up, and I think on the whole, as I've said, it was a very useful and necessary trip.
Other aides were less confident.
The Vance mission was a big disappointment to us. The Russians adopted a very intransigent attitude, and that was a disappointment to those who thought that perhaps we could start the new administration, the Carter administration, with some wide-ranging agreement with the Russians. It became clear that this would be much more difficult.
I think most of us on the American side knew the fat was in the world publicity fire. That here the Carter administration had gone to Moscow with new hopes, new dreams to limit the nuclear arms race, and had failed. That it meant somehow we didn't understand the Soviets, that the Carter team was inept, and that we would not be able to manage Soviet-American relations. So this was to be a deep stab wound.
Carter proposed a 3% increase in the American defense budget. But those who saw détente as a trap demanded not parity, but nuclear superiority.
There was a strong view that détente was not working, that the United States was becoming progressively weaker. The Soviet Union, not only progressively, stronger in relationship to the United States and the West, but also more aggressive.
Новейшие достижения наших ученых, инженеров, рабочих воплощены в оружии армии и флота. И прежде всего в вооружении ракетных войск стратегического назначения главной ударной силы советских вооруженных сил. Мы в одной из частей ракетных войск.
The Soviets were still pouring resources into their military buildup. Huge deposits of oil and natural gas in Siberia had insulated the Soviet Union from the oil price rises which had caused recession in the West. Oil earned the Soviet Union much-needed hard currency. The Soviet people were constantly told that their country was thriving and able to match the West in everything.
Никогда еще страна наша не располагала таким огромным экономическим и научно-техническим потенциалом. Никогда еще не была столь прочна, столь надежным ее обороноспособность.
In reality, defense expenditure was draining the civilian economy. By 1977, the geriatric Leonid Brezhnev was no longer in full control.
Врачи стали ограничивать время его работы.
The doctors began to limit the time he was allowed to work. His eyesight was going. We had to change the font of his typewriter to the largest one possible. At that time, the whole central running of the state was in disarray.
Каждый член Политбюро
Each member of the Politburo began to work in his own interests and in the interests of the section of the economy he represented.
Beyond the Kremlin, ordinary Russians were increasingly apathetic. Living standards were poor. Communist idealism had evaporated. Everyday life was drab. Détente had not changed the Soviet Union's repressive ways. The pressure to respect human rights increased East-West tensions. In 1975, Brezhnev, Ford, and 33 other leaders had signed the Helsinki Declaration. For the first time, the West had a powerful political weapon to defend the cause of human rights behind the Iron Curtain.
Thanks to the Helsinki Accord, which the Soviets saw as just a piece of paper, the attention of the world media turned to our cause. Suddenly, the American Congress was dealing with it. Heads of state were dealing with it. It started influencing the whole character of relations between East and West.
I was very convinced before I became president that basic human rights, equality of opportunity, the end of abuse by governments of their people was a basic principle on which the United States